Hello. We did our first segment on Harold Bloom from The American Religion, his chapter on Jehovah's Witnesses. Here's the second portion of that discussion. To consider Jehovah's Witnesses in the here and now necessarily has to be a somewhat painful intellectual experience. Anti-intellectualism among millenarians and Bible literalists is a recurrent phenomenon. But no other religious movement in America ever has been as programmatically set against its intellect as are Jehovah's Witnesses. The fundamentalist majority wing of the Southern Baptist Convention are devotees of pure reason compared to Jehovah's Witnesses. Disdain for the intellect or for knowledge from the perspective of biblical inerrancy is very different from a hatred of mind, a hatred that surpasses even the witnesses' loathing for government, all other religion, and business. It may be that the most theocratic movement in America is bound to fear and hate intelligence. One could also surmise that the chagrin of perpetually delayed apocalypse turns the witnesses against any rational apprehension of self-contradiction. But I suspect that the true origin of the aggressiveness and hostility of Jehovah's Witnesses is to be found in their preferred text, the Revelation of St. John the Divine. The influence of Revelation always has been out of all proportion to its literary strength or spiritual value. Though it has affected the strongest poets from Dante and Spencer through Milton onto Blake and Shelley, it has also enthralled the quacks and cranks of all ages down to the present moment in America. A lurid and inhumane work, very poorly composed in the original, the Apocalypse of St. John was rightly called one of the nightmares of anxiety and triumph by the late Northrop Frye. It is a nightmare of a book, without wisdom, goodness, kindness, or affection of any kind. D.H. Lawrence judged it pungently. The Apocalypse does not worship power, it wants to murder the powerful, to seize power itself, the weakling. That's D.H. Lawrence's summary. Now, of course, all of us are going to disagree with his judgment, and many great literary critics, and he's named a few here, such as Blake and Shelley, as well as Milton, disagree violently with this opinion. Anyway, Bloom goes on. There, in my own judgment, is the heart of the aspiration of Jehovah's Witnesses. Like the book they study incessantly, they too wish to murder the powerful, in the churches, in government, in commerce. Their psychic need is what Lawrence associates with John of Patmos, archetype of all the pale priests of resentment. Intellectually weak, spiritually empty, Jehovah's Witnesses dream of seizing power itself, so as to share in the majesty of the great theocrat Jehovah. The principal doctrines of this most apocalyptic of religious movements are few and rudimentary, and cannot be said to constitute a theology, which after all demands thought and some effort to resolve self-contradictions. The central dogma, according to Penton in Apocalypse Delayed, is that of the faithful and discreet slave, who is always the reigning theocrat, the more than pope of Jehovah's Witnesses. The president of the Watchtower Society, to give him his formal title, is the authorized interpreter of the Bible, which the individual witness most certainly is not free to read for himself. Nor is the witness free to inquire why the rapture is continually postponed. And of course, that's not an appropriate term for what Jehovah's Witnesses hope, but I know what he means. Russell prophesied it first for 1878, then for 1881, then 1914. Rutherford named 1925 as the year, and from 1965 on, the Society pointed toward 1975. No sublime year has since replaced 1975. He wrote this in 92. And perhaps none will be ventured until we touch the year 2000. It is one of the functions of the faithful and discreet slave of Jehovah to hush these speculations, presumably until the powerful slave progresses further in revelation. A related crux, also not to be pondered except by authority, is the very identity of the faithful. Witness dogma brings together Matthew 24, verse 45, where Jesus speaks of the faithful and discreet slave whom his master appointed over his domestics, to give them food at the proper time, and Revelation 7, 4-8, and 14, 1-3, where the redeemed Israel is counted as precisely 144,000 souls, or 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. That might seem to allow for only 144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses, and so to exclude several million of the devout. Russell had identified his early followers as the nucleus of the 144,000 king priests who would serve Jesus Christ throughout the millennium, while insisting that the great bulk of mankind would be resurrected into a restored earthly paradise. Later, Watchtower seers had pointed to a third rabblement, the great multitude of Revelation 7 verse 9, who would hold on also to a less glorious, who would hold on also in a less glorious manner. These would be the sheep of Matthew 25, 31-46, who would be separated out from the hopeless fourth rabblement, or goats. President Rutherford, in his most picturesque insight, found the foretype of the sheep in Jonadab, the Rechabite, who assisted Jehu of Israel in his purge of Jezebel's Baalite priests. That is 2 Kings 10, verse 15. In 1935, Rutherford set in motion the still ongoing missionary enterprise of the Witnesses by arguing that all the great multitude, all the class of sheep, were Jonadabs who will live forever in this world in return for obedience to the Watchtower Society. Since Rutherford also proclaimed in 1935 that all of the sacred 144,000 had already been chosen, so that only a few replacements would be allowed for those who had fallen away, it would seem that most Jonadabs were relegated forever to a kind of secondary status. In praxis, however, the Witnesses have been very shrewd, and on a day-to-day basis it has become far better to be a Jonadab than one of the elect. Until 1973, the movement's leaders were confident that the remnant of the elect would shrink as Armageddon hovered closer. But from 1973 to 1975, so many new converts announced themselves as called to the Lord's Supper of the anointed elect that manifestly there were more than the mystic 144,000 claiming that status. The Society's pragmatic response has been plain nastiness exerted against any witness not yet in old age who asserted election. A convert to the movement thus is welcomed graciously if she or he is a Jonadab, and well nigh ostracized if one of the elect, however intense the mystical conviction may be. It is Watchtower teaching that the selection of the elect began at Pentecost, so most of the congregation have been selected, died, and from 1918 onward have been roused to heavenly life. Thus only a remnant of kingdom heirs, now just over 9,000 in number, are left among us today. And of course that number is now more like 20,000. The great crowd of Jonadabs are not actually part of Christ's new covenant, and so have no mediator. Therefore they are not sanctified, thus justified by faith, and will be only after the advent of Armageddon has brought about the millennium of Christ's reign on earth. During that 1,000 years, the faithful and fortunate Jonadabs will endure 2 major tests by Satan and his legions. If they pass, then they will be saved, thus justifying finally what might now be termed the pragmatic motto of Jehovah's Witnesses: don't pride yourself upon being one of the 144,000. Be glad you are a Jonadab. Since human existence ended anyway in 1975, we are all posthumous, and to be a Jonadab is certainly a step up from being a kind of ghost. Jonadabs, I venture, are to Jehovah's Witnesses what malicious animal magnetism is to Christian Science, a superb contribution to American mythology, each quite as inventive as anything to be found in Herman Melville or in Thomas Pynchon. A brief chart of the Watchtower Society's current chronology is another substantial augmentation of the mythical imagination. And then he lists the dates that are still significant to the Watchtower: 607, the fall of Jerusalem, beginning of the times of the Gentiles; 455 BC, the decree to build Jerusalem's walls; the start of the 70 weeks of Daniel 9; AD 29, the baptism of Christ, the death of Christ in 33, the end of the 70 weeks in AD 36, the end of the times of the Gentiles 1914, and the beginning of the time of the end 1918, Christ coming to his temple for judgment, AD 1919, the fall of Babylon the Great, and the birth of the new nation of Jehovah's Witnesses, and finally AD 1975, the end of 6,000 years of human existence. More to come. I'll put in a link to Dwayne Magnani's discussion, which we revisited after another 24 years had gone by from 1975, bringing us up to the turn of the millennium. And the Watchtower, of course, hadn't backed off its emphasis that that generation was going to be the last. So we asked at that point, how many generations have now died in a false hope?